Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to another mod with me. Today we are going to be edging and trimming the Anima Mundi Tarot. So this is a tarot deck that I've had actually for quite some time. And to be perfectly honest, it's a deck that I have put up for trade several times, but it just has never left my collection. So I feel like maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe I just need to wait for the right time and place. Now, I really love the artwork in this deck, and it is primarily an animal deck, which was not something that I was really able to connect with. It does have some great pip style minors, but I wasn't really in a place where I was connecting with animal decks when I got this deck. And since then, I really have been connecting with animal decks. I've gotten a few that have kind of helped me, I think, make that connection. And I've really been kind of wanting to work with this one again and to give it a try. But it does have a couple cards in it that, you know, this is one of them that just really gets me. But it does have some wonderful cards in it for the most part. I really do like the majority of them. The one thing that I think also keeps me from working with this deck is that it has this super shiny gold gilding, and you know, if you've watched any of my other mods with the gold gilding, like, I'm just really not a fan. It cuts into my hands. I don't like it, and it's just, you know, it's just not my favorite. I mean, granted, it looks pretty, but mine also came kind of chipped up already. This deck has been used a little bit. I used it, and my kiddo used it for a little while, but it was too much of a pip style deck for my kiddo, so I ended up with it back. And then I do love the whales. That card right there, though, that's the one that kind of does me in. Love that card. So it did end up back in my collection, and I think maybe then it's time I give it a go. I just think I need to take the gilding off of it, make it a little bit smaller, a little bit easier for me to handle. I do think that I might take it down to just the artwork, because in the artwork itself, we do have the number correspondences for the majors. And for the minors, like I said, they're very much pip style, so I think I will be able to recognize them. The only issue might be the quartz, because while they do have the symbol for the court card on it, I'm not sure that I'm going to know that this is the page, this is the knight, this is the queen, and this is the king, right? So that really is my only concern with taking the titles completely off. But if you can see here, like, I would have to decide whether I wanted to take the top or the bottom off. I could also just trim the gold gilding off and leave it with just the a smaller white border around it. But I really think this deck, I have seen it trimmed completely borderless, and I think it looks absolutely beautiful. So I think what I'll do is just make myself a little cheat sheet. I'm going to take a couple pictures of the court cards before I get to chopping into this deck. And then I will be able to reference that later on if I have confusion about which card is which, until I get a chance to really know them better. But as you can see, for the minors, like, we have the 8 cups on the card. So I don't think that is going to be a problem at all. You know, we have 2 swords, here we have 3. That's another one that gets me. But the rest of the cards are beautiful. It's really just the 10 and the 3 of swords, right? I mean, it's always the 10 and the 3 of swords. I really wish creators would start putting in 2 different versions of this, so that people who don't necessarily read this in a Rider-Waite sense as, you know, finality and death, that would give us some alternatives. And a card like this, it's kind of hard to work your way back around that, right? I mean, I can do it. I've done it for many other Rider-Waite-Smith clones, but this one with all the blood and everything, I mean, it is a bit harder. And that's another reason why I haven't really been wanting to work with this deck a whole lot, is because I do kind of have issue with those 2 cards, but really is just those 2 cards. So I'm going to take all the gold borders off of it, or the gold edging off of it, and take it down to just the artwork, and hope that it connects a little bit better That way, like I said, I've tried to move this deck on a couple of different times now, and it always comes back to me, so I feel like there's a reason for that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and modify it, take it down to the artwork, take that sharp gold gilding off, and see if we can make a little bit better connection. Gorgeous backs on these decks. I'm thinking that I'm going to do it in like this brown color with some stamps, because I think that would be really beautiful. Although edging it in gold stamp would be really pretty too. But so that's the plan for today. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so before we begin, let's talk tools. I have my deck, of course. I have my Fiskars trimmer that I use. I have my little triangle ruler that I use as a guide for the other side, and my washi tape to hold it down, and my corner rounder for when we are done trimming the deck. So these are the tools that I pretty much use every time. We'll talk about the inks that I'm going to use to edge this deck when we get to that portion, because I never quite know what I'm going to do with a deck in terms of edging most of the time until I have it trimmed and I've gone through the whole process, because that process is a little bit of a bonding experience. So it allows me to kind of get to know the deck a little bit better and to maybe see what colors that I feel might work well on the edges. So now to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and cut off probably we'll just start with the top and do the sides. And I always leave the title areas for last, just in case I change my mind at some point during this mod. Because sometimes when I get the 3 sides off, I think that's good enough, and I'm fine with leaving the titles. Because there is this like double inner border here and the little notches in each of the corners, I'm thinking that's probably not going to be the case with this deck, but rather safe than sorry. So that's the process that I generally use, particularly when I'm looking at taking a deck totally down to the artwork. So the first thing that I'm going to do is pretty much repeat the process I'm sure you guys have seen me do 100 times. Just real quick, checking in with the back. I always like to check the back to make sure that I'm not going to do any like something terribly funky with the back. Although, to be perfectly honest, even when something funky totally happens with the back, most of the time I really don't mind, because I don't pay a whole lot of attention to the backs. Those aren't really the important parts. I like them to be pretty, and it's great when they can be uniform, but it's not a necessity for me that the backs be, you know, retain any sort of symmetry or anything like that. I do not read reversals, so if a back ends up wonky one way or the other, it doesn't impede my reading style in any way, shape, or form. Because the little symbol on the back here is really quite nicely in the middle of the cards, I think that it's going to be fine. But I do always like to double check just in case. So the first thing that I'm going to do is kind of decide where I want to make my first cut. I did forget, I always do use my ruler, because the width of my ruler here is the same width between the guard and the blade, so that I know exactly where my blade's going to come down. And I do want to take it down to that inner border, so I want to take all of the artwork off. And so I'm just going to double check here to make sure that I am going to get all of that off. Now I do like to kind of err on the side of caution and take a little bit more, because the printing generally varies from card to card, and it's not 100% the same. And so I generally like to be a little bit cautious and, you know, just a little extra when I can. So I think that probably looks good right about there. And it is not pressed up against the top. Really important that you get your deck pressed up against completely flush everywhere that you can, so that you do get a nice straight cut. So let's try that. So I put a piece of washi down here to hold that card in place, and then I use my guide here to create a barrier for this side, because it makes the whole trimming process go quite a bit faster for me. Just gonna double check. It looks like it's lined up. We do want to get things as straight as possible so that we do get a nice straight cut. And we're gonna go ahead and make our first cut. And that gets that white border off. The little notch from that actually might not be far enough. However, I'm thinking that when I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a little bit of that white notch in there. But I do think that once I cut this side off and then I corner round it, I think the corner rounder is probably going to snip the rest of that off. So I think that should be fine. I do want to retain as much of the artwork as possible because this deck is going to get very small. You know, you can see the artwork size is a little closer to like playing card size, maybe even a little bit, just a little bit larger than Lenormand. So I do just want to make sure that I get the cards, you know, down to removing the borders as much as possible, but I also want to make sure that I am, I feel like that's not straight, so I keep checking it. Sometimes the eye can deceive you because the printing is never 100%, and I've said it a million times before, I'll probably say it a million times again. That's just how printing is. So yeah, I think I just got a little too much off on my Fool card, which is fine. Again, I can, you know, these don't come out perfect, so it is important to note that none of this is perfect. It is trimming by hand, so there will be minor imperfections. But overall, using this little system that I've rigged up here usually makes the process go pretty quickly, and it creates for a pretty nice, pretty even trim. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up taking the tops off, and then we'll check back in. Okay, so I have trimmed the top off all of the cards, and I noticed that on some of them that little divot in here is further down than on others. So I might have to go back at the end after I get the two sides off and trim a little bit more off the top. Sometimes that does happen, particularly when you have little intricate borders like this. And for me, because with the guide it's a really fairly quick process, that's okay. That doesn't really you know, bother me a ton. It does happen from time to time. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and do the two sides, because like I said, I might have to go back and and take some more off the top. So we're going to go ahead and give it a go. So it took it all off, and you can see here that it took off quite a bit of that, but like I said, I'm a little bit worried that on some of them it's not going to be enough, because I think when I corner around this, I think that it's going to, I think that it's going to leave some white. But I'm going to go ahead and keep at it because I'd rather take more off the top or the bottom than the sides, because this already is going to be, like, as you can see here, it's already going to be a really small deck. So I'm going to try to keep it, you know, as uniform as I can, and retain as much of the artwork as I can. So I'm going to go ahead and finish trimming probably off both sides, and then we'll check back in and see what it looks like. So I finished trimming the two sides on the deck, and you can see that it's getting like really skinny. So it's definitely going to be a pocket deck when it's done. You definitely get a sense of like how big the artwork is, right? Because we have these big borders that encase it, and the artwork is actually quite small. Now, one thing I did notice I talked about, I tend to wait to cut the titles off until the last. And throughout the Major Arcana and the Courts, the titles are all on the bottom, which actually probably wouldn't have looked too bad because the little notches kind of make a nice little design in there. But the problem is that when you get to the minors, all except for the Courts and the Aces, the numbers were at the top. So if I wanted to leave it, now I've got just these blank titles at the bottoms of all the cards. Now I could write in the number for sure if I wanted to leave the titles at the bottom. And quite honestly, that thought did cross my mind, because I could take a fine tip Sharpie and just write in the numbers, and then that would allow me to leave the titles on the bottom to still get a pretty borderless edition, and to maintain those court cards that I was a little bit unsure of. But I think I'm going to go ahead and just trim them off anyway, because I think that this deck, I mean, I have seen it trimmed completely borderless, and it is quite stunning. It is very small. It's definitely a tiny little pocket deck by the time you're done trimming off all of the borders. But I think I'm going to go ahead and do that just to make it a nice, completely borderless deck. Now, the other thing that, of course, you're probably noticing is that I have these little white marks at the both top corners, and that is from those little designs, and I mentioned that was probably going to be an issue. So at this point, what I'm going to do is actually go back and trim a little bit more off the top just to get rid of those, because I think if I quarter round it, because they are varying sizes, you can see here, like the full one, the white space doesn't go, or the little white mark doesn't go quite into the card as far as this one does on the Empress. And so because they vary slightly, I decided I'm just going to cut them off and not try to worry about getting the quarter rounder to fix that for me. Now, I do have to be careful because the majors all have numbers at the top, the Roman numerals, so I don't want to cut into those. And some of them appear to go further up than others. I feel like the 0 here on the full is up further than the rest of them, but I could be wrong. So anyway, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just basically reset, take a little bit more off the top of all the cards, and then go back and take the bottoms off. And then we'll come and check back in and look at some colors. So I finished trimming the entire deck, and it's really cute and pocket size now. Even the backs ended up looking pretty great. Look at that. I think they came out wonderful. I used the medium corner rounder on this one. And of course I went back and trimmed the tops off to get those little white notches off and trimmed the bottoms. And I think they look really beautiful. The skies in this deck are really pretty. And I love the color palette. So gorgeous, look at that. All the blues and the browns. So I thought in terms of edging, I thought I would kind of play off the back a little bit. I did, you know, some marker color swatches. I did some distressed ink color swatches. And I think what I'm going to try to do is, if you can see here, there is this kind of antique-y gold. This really looks close to this antique linen here in the boxes and the moons. And then we have this sort of lighter brown and darker brown accents. Now, generally, in a card like this, I would probably try to do like a 3-layer effect like I did with my Enchanted Forest Tarot, or Tarot of an Enchanted Forest, whichever it is, to do that kind of gradient effect. But these cards are really small, and I'm not sure if I can get a gradient effect on them or not without, you know, completely losing all the detail. So at the very least, I thought it would be pretty to maybe do the antique linen kind of in the middle as like a sort of glowing spot in the middle. And then I'm going to use the vintage photo around the outsides to just kind of blend that in. Now, I did pull out my walnut stain. So I have my 3 different, I think they're right here. The antique linen, the vintage photo, and the walnut stain. They look very different on paper than they do on the cards, just to let you know. But I thought what I would do is do the antique linen in the middle as like a kind of a glow, do the vintage photo as the primary, and then I pulled out the walnut stain because one of two things. Either if this all goes horribly wrong, I can do the walnut stain because it's a much darker brown, kind of closer to this kind of black brown we see up here. I can do that over the whole card and just kind of cover it up if it ends up looking really weird. Sometimes when I do the gradients, you know, in that way, sometimes it doesn't look quite right. Now, of course, I could like section the deck off and do, you know, some in the antique linen, some in the vintage photo, and some in the walnut stain, and that would probably be really pretty too, especially when you mix them all together. But I kind of wanted to give this a try just to see. I've only done it on a couple of decks, so this is a relatively small deck, which means that for one, you can't do a whole lot of variation in the colors in terms of going crossways across it, like horizontally, right? Because there's just not the space as there would be in a traditional size tarot or like a large oracle deck. However, it also means that it takes less time to do, so I have a tendency to kind of want to do a little bit more fancier things with my smaller decks just because it's a little bit quicker. Anyway, I thought it would be fun to try, and if it all goes horribly wrong, I'm just going to cover it up with the walnut stain. If it goes very well, I might try to just darken each of the 4 corners with the walnut stain just to kind of add another layer to that effect. So we'll see how that all goes. That's kind of my plan. And to start with, what I'm going to do is pick up all my cards and just run some of this antique linen in the center. Now I'm not going to, I don't think that's really picking up color at all, to be perfectly honest. Let's try the big one, as much as I don't like using my big one for cards. For one, it just kind of, you know, destroys them. And two, I do use these for other paper crafting projects. So I'm just going to run that in the center, and I always wipe off the excess, and then I'll come back with the vintage photo and add some of that around the center, around the outsides of it. So I'm not paying like a whole lot of attention to where it's going on because I am going to blend it all together. So I'm going to go ahead and finish putting the antique linen on, and then we'll check back in. Okay, so I got the yellow added. You can see here that, of course, I didn't do it over the corners and I didn't do the tops because I'm going to do those in the vintage photo. But you can see I've definitely got that yellow color here, which actually would look really nice on this deck all on its own. Like I could have done, I think, the whole deck in yellow, and I think that would have looked pretty. But what I want to do is go ahead and add some of that darker in to pull this darker brown in. And basically, you know, my idea here is to kind of let the antique linen kind of create this glow effect on the side of the deck. Or at least that is... that's the plan, that's the hope anyway, so we'll see how it goes. I'm not going to really pay too much attention about where I'm edging. I know that I got the antique linen pretty close to the corners, and this one is just coming up all kinds of places. Might have to get a different brown. Once your stamps start really chunking up like that, it's not really a great thing. And then maybe I can use my my fingers, or I could use a paper towel, right? And kind of blend that in a little bit better on the sides. Because I don't want to cover up all that beautiful antique linen color. I just want to blend it. So let's try that for a couple cards and see how it goes. I can always reblend these ones. I just, you know, have to do so carefully. Oh yeah, that was much better. These few where I kind of blended it, blend a lot better. These 3 look like they have harsh lines, so I'm gonna have to fix those. So I'm gonna leave those separate, and I am gonna go ahead and finish up doing this very lengthy process to my deck to get that sort of variegated or that gradient effect along the sides. So we'll take a look when I'm all done and see what it looks like. So I have finished with all of my trimming and edging of this deck, and look at the backs. Look how awesome they came out. That little emblem that was in the center actually feels like proportional, like it fits to this deck. This deck is amazing trimmed. I love the artwork this way. We don't have that white border that's distracting from it. Again, I did take off the titles, which I think you could totally leave, but the majors do have numbers, so that helps a little bit, and most of the minors are fairly recognizable. It's just the court cards that I will have issue with, but I actually recognize some of them now after working with it, so I don't think that's a problem. Here's the real fun part that I did. I did this gradient edging, so we have the antique linen on the inside with the vintage photo wrapped around both sides, and then I did the top first in the vintage photo and it wasn't dark enough, so then I used the walnut stain, and look at that. That is just amazing. Now this is a really time consuming process, so all in I'm about like an hour of trimming and about 2 hours of edging, but it's like, for me, it's totally worth it because it looks beautiful and I love it. Let's go ahead and give it a little shuffle. This deck did shuffle pretty nice before because it has a nice linen cardstock. So I can't really like bridge it back, but it definitely riffle shuffles, which is nice. So now let's lay a few cards out and just see how they look. And get all court cards. Actually, because there's so little, we can do multiples. Let's just do a couple more. Yeah, so I'm actually pretty pleased with the way it came out. It's definitely a pocket-sized deck now. Here's the little box it came in, and so you can see that the cards were this size. So you can see that I've taken off quite a bit. So these have become quite a tiny little pocket deck, but I think it's actually really cute and it works really well. So I'm quite pleased with it. I'm excited to try working with it again, particularly now that I'm working more with animal decks. So hopefully this one will connect with me a little bit more, especially now that I've taken all that excess off of it and I've spent all that time with it, modifying it and edging it. Thank you for joining me for this mod with me. You will find links for the decks and products that I have used in this video in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this process and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.